Until I actually have my freedom back in my hand, I'm not going to believe I'll see it again.
Well, you might be waiting a long time for that, Peter, but I
Well,
want
there
to
is
move
that,
on.
yeah. But I thought all this stuff would happen after I was dead. I'm slightly perplexed to find that the final strangulation of my country, as I knew it, is taking place while I'm still alive.
Hello there, and welcome to Wrong Ways Columbia Cast, our first installment of 2021. And we're starting off the new year with a big hitter, outspoken British journalist Peter Hitchens, author of a number of critically acclaimed books, including The Rage Against God and The War We Never Fought, the British establishment's surrender to drugs. Peter, thanks for taking the time to join us. And I just want to start off on your background for those who may not be too familiar with you this side of the Atlantic Ocean, and shame on them for that. But in many ways, you're almost a perfect example of that old saying, erroneously attributed, I think, to Winston Churchill, that if you're not liberal when you're 25, you've no heart, and if you're not conservative by the time you're 35, you've no brain. So you've basically passed through the whole political spectrum, or at least swung left to right. Now, I know you addressed this in The Rage Against God, but can you give us an abridged version of how you went from an education in plush Christian boarding schools to being an atheist and radical socialist to now being a member of the Anglican Church and a traditional conservative?
There's nothing plush about boarding schools I went to, I'll tell you.
Okay.
Luxury was not their reason for existing. They were, by the standards of today, probably they would be known to criminal prosecution. But as it was, no, luxury and plushness were not what they were about. I was glad to be shot at them, I have to say. The idea was,
Okay.
but there's nothing exceptional about what I've done until 30 or 40 years ago. What I did was totally normal. People are indeed radical, idealistic, and all kinds of other things in their youth, and then they stop. And that was the pattern of life probably for 3,000 years until the 1960s. And in the 1960s, it changed, and people stopped growing up when they reached their 20s and continued to be teenagers all their lives. You get them, you see the Rolling Stones concerts, men in their 60s, cramming themselves into inappropriate jeans, bald and fat, who am I to talk? But still teenagers in everything but appearance.
Yeah.
And that's normal. Whereas what I've done, people keep asking me, well, why did you do this extraordinary thing? I said, I didn't. I just did what everybody else has done down all the ages. It really is time people asked the radicals in their 60s and 70s, the Rolling Stones concert attenders who are drawing pensions, why it is that they haven't grown up. It's a much more interesting question, one which is seldom asked. I can't really give you any more detail than that I did what was normal, and that doesn't seem anything remarkable about it to me. In fact, it's a boring cliche, isn't it? People acquire responsibilities to get some experience of life and cease to be vapidly idealistic.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so you think those people now on the radical left, and to use the word of the times, the woke people, are just people who have failed to grow up and take responsibility?
Why should they grow up? What is there in modern life to make them grow up? The world was revolutionized in the 60s to suit them. Demands and initiations which once lay in the path of people wanting to take part in adult life were removed. Everything was made fantastically easy. They were not required to grow up, so they didn't. I preferred to grow up. I remember this distinct decision, which was perhaps typical of it, which was deciding that I really wasn't going to listen to popular music anymore. It was time I knew something about and learnt the classics, so I just did. And to this day, anything recorded after about 1969, if I hear it in the background or on the radio, I don't know what it's called. And if people name songs and what we used to call groups and now bizarrely called bands after that date, I have no idea what they sound like or look like. I just stopped. It seemed to me to be something that a grown-up person should no longer be interested in, like this switching from Coca-Cola to learning to drink decent wine. But people seem to prefer Coca-Cola for the mind, and that's what they do. But I didn't. I just felt it was time to grow up. I did have, I mean, an experience I did have, which a lot of people don't have. I don't urge it on them, which may have caused me to begin the long process of change, was crashing my motorcycle into the side of a pork pie lorry one morning in a country lane outside Oxford. I very nearly lost at least part of my leg and experienced for the first time in my life real pain, just on the edge of blackout pain, and spent some time in hospital. And that may have set me on a path towards maturity, which other people don't have. I don't know. Over the years, it grows in force, that experience, in conscious force, but it may have exerted an unconscious force. But I can't see I can't see everybody has to have a motorbike crash to grow up. It seems to me to be a pretty stiff rule to try to impose.
Well, like my experience of people who, if I can say this, rediscover God later in life, generally they do have a big moment, be it they were drug addicts or had an alcohol addiction or something like that. Now, your kind of rediscovering of God will be seen as, if I can say this as well, God light. It's not kind of fundamentalist Christian, which I find a lot of people who may have been Catholics or Anglican growing up, brought into that tradition, then became atheists and then rediscovered God, but more as fundamentalists. But you've returned to the Church of England and the traditional church.
I can't think of anything more opposite to Trotskyism than Anglican Christianity, which is one of the reasons I chose it. I've seen enough of sort of Douglas Hyde types, people who'd been in the Communist Party and it had become their life, and who then become Roman Catholics and had in one way swapped one dogma-driven world for another, and I didn't find that at all appealing. Anglicanism is subtle, open-minded, thoughtful, and reasoning. And it's very beautiful, say the traditional version of it is. And I think that in beauty and poetry, an awful lot of things can be expressed, even in the modern world, which is very hard to express in ordinary, particularly the banal English of our day. So it appealed to me for many, many reasons. But I have to say the fact that it was absolutely not a sectarian or drum-beating version of the faith appealed to me. I've had enough of that. Any attempts at sectarianism of any kind, I fight off, and I get really angry when anybody else tells me what to believe.
Yeah, of course.
I wouldn't do that to you, so don't do it to me. So people will say to me on Twitter, "Oh, become a Catholic." I go, "Sorry, it's none of your business what I believe, and it's none of my business what you believe. Stay out of this." And it's a real involuntary crossness. It doesn't. It's not one that I have to work myself up to. It really just makes me angry that anybody should say. There's a number of things I just don't like people trying to tell me what to do, what to think, what to wear, and indeed what to do. Actually,
Yeah.
It's not. The whole point of being an adult is you've worked out how to behave.
But we hope.
Yeah, well, if you haven't, then that's another matter. But if you have within reason, I think people should just. It was once said, I think, by a Chinese sage that the secret of good government was to let men alone. And the first time I read that, I thought, yeah, that's good. I'll try to stick by that one if I possibly can.
Yeah, but unfortunately, the Chinese didn't take that one up themselves.
No, alas, not. No, they certainly aren't taking it now.
No. Now, of course, you said you don't like to be told what to believe, what to wear, whatever, but you did get into big debates with your late brother, Christopher, who's the complete opposite of you, really.
No, he's not. It's alarming to his enthusiasts who find my existence rather disturbing. But actually, there are some similarities. The greatest one being independence of mind. It doesn't necessarily lead you to the same thing, but it leads you away from certain things. It certainly leads you away from wearisome choirs of agreement. You need to consider any proposition before you support it, and you'll often find that even if you do support it, you support it more critically than some of its opponents do. It's a state of being which I feel I'm very privileged to have. It's not it's part of some gifts which I suspect I've been given. It's not a virtue on my part. It wasn't a virtue on his, but it is, on the other hand, a great advantage for anyone to have it. But it's very hard for anyone to follow someone with independence of mind wherever they wish to go, because it's often very hard to tell what they will do next. And so people say, well, you want, I want to be your fan. I say, well, don't be. I said, what I want is readers, but I would much rather you disagreed with me than that you in any way sought to revere me. I don't want to be revered. It'd be ridiculous to revere me anyway, because there's nothing worth revering. But it's thoughtful agreement I'm happy with, but I'm in many ways just as happy with thoughtful disagreement. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, coming back to the quote that I mentioned.
So was he. I think it's also true of him.
Okay, but I was going to say, just personally, I was raised a Catholic and had no say in the matter, of course, as most of us in Ireland, we don't have a say in that. But, like, yes, I would be a non-believer now. I'm certainly not a practicing Catholic. But some people kind of label atheists or agnostics as morally inferior. And again, it comes back to your point about don't tell me what to believe, don't tell me what to wear and all that kind of stuff. I see a lot of people of religion who, as far as I'm concerned, are worse human beings than I am.
Well, we don't know, do we? We know so little about others, and in many cases, not all that much about ourselves, because we conceal so much from ourselves. And I long ago, I judge actions, not people. And if someone does an action which is clearly voluntary, which is horrible to me, then I will condemn the action. But you have to remember that the person involved has other characteristics just as you do, unknown to you, and that the only judgment, ultimately, if there is a judgment, is an eternal one, which you can't make because you lack the knowledge. It's one of the reasons why the golden rule is so useless as a basis for operation, and do as you would be done by. It's so easily replaced by the much more practical and effective pretend to do as you would be done by, and most people won't know the difference. This is one of the reasons why the dimension of the eternal is so important in how people truly behave. But I would say that it's ridiculous to think of atheists being worse people or indeed doing worse actions, because the atheist has adopted a scale of beliefs which can't be judged on the Christian scale of goodness or wickedness anyway. The atheist's fundamental decision is to say, well, I prefer to live in a universe which is a cosmic car crash, an accident without significance, in which there are no eternal laws and in which actions have no importance beyond their observable immediate effect. If you do that, I mean, there may be a reason why you've chosen that, and I often think that's the most interesting thing about atheism, why people choose to be atheists, because I'm quite certain that belief is driven by desire and is a choice. Anybody can believe anything unknowable if they want to, because there's nothing preventing you from believing things. The only thing which prevents you from believing a thing is knowledge that it's not true. And on the question of whether God exists and how the universe came to being, we don't know. So you've got a complete choice, and you can. And it's fascinating to me as to why people don't. But very often when I have this attempt to have this conversation with atheists, oh, no, I had no choice. I was unable to believe. So I just think that's piffle. Everybody can believe if they want to.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. Obviously, that brings to mind your brother's epistemological razor, as it's called, or philosophical razor. What is it? What can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. I'm sure that one's been thrown.
That backfired completely upon it, because atheism can be asserted without evidence, and indeed is and has to be. Yeah. So what? I mean, I know that. I'm not the idea of entering into an and say, yes, my belief's true and yours not, is repellent to me. Why would I bother? They are beliefs precisely because they are about the unknowable. As I say, half the point of the Enlightenment and reason and the discovery of the scientific method is that there are things you can no longer believe because they're demonstrably untrue. So you can't believe them. But among the things which you can believe is some sort of idea of a divinely created and ordered universe. And even Einstein, when I say even, I think probably especially Einstein, fascinating essay in which we all know Einstein was not a religious believer by any body of standards, but he was also not an atheist. He wrote this beautiful description of the universe as a vast library of unread books in which nobody really knew anything, except that there was a pattern to be seen. What it led to, the question he was being asked at the time was whether he was a pantheist, and I think the answer that he came back with sounded pretty much like probably. But there are many, many positions between religious belief and atheism, and it's perfectly possible for very well-informed, particularly scientifically well-informed people to take them without embarrassing themselves. There are many distinguished scientists who've been religious believers, so it's not that there's very it's typical of our wretched education systems these days. So many people believe that scientific understanding and knowledge is incompatible with religious belief, which is not true.
Yeah, well, I guess the bottom line is, Peter, nobody has all the answers. Nobody knows. So
at the moment, no. So far, there's a lot of things which are way beyond us, and the nature and origins of the universe, and whether or not there is a directing mind or force, and whether the universe is purposeful or not, we cannot know. But I certainly would much rather it was so, and would behave as far as possible as if I believed that.
But is it because then it gives you kind of comfort when you're lying in bed at night and thinking deeply that, well, when this life is over, there is something to go to?
I expect you have it too. Most people have very strong desires which come, they know not whence. One of mine is for justice. And any educated, traveled person discovers pretty quickly that justice doesn't exist in this world. So why do we have a desire for justice and a world in which it doesn't happen? There are 2 points which it's very important to me to believe. One is that, because I think that if there is eternity and there is justice in eternity, that is the only dimension in which it can take place, and I thirst for justice. The other is, of course, the fact that we live lives often of considerable depth and importance to those around us. We can do a great deal of both harm and good to those around us. We leave behind us a great number of things, and we've had during those lives distinct and very finely formed and detailed characters, and have been granted extraordinary gifts of consciousness and perception, and indeed the mysterious gift of conscience as well. I find it very hard to believe that this is simply extinguished in death. That all that just goes to waste, that anything of that so complex and rich simply vanishes. And again, the idea that there is something beyond death seems to me to make more sense, and to answer the questions of what the purpose of our lives might be much better than the idea that death is just an extinction, an end of consciousness, and a long, a long goodbye.
I guess maybe a semi-scientific way to look at it is that we are a ball of energy, and when we die, that energy just doesn't disappear. It goes somewhere else, I guess. And whether you look at that in a spiritual way.
If death is the end, it goes nowhere. It just ceases to exist, like any worn-out item which is no longer fulfilling a function. I imagine you've been present at death and have seen the transformation in the aspects of the human form when someone ceases to be alive. It's enormous. A great deal goes missing in a very short period of time. Where has it gone? I think somewhere. The atheist thinks nowhere. Again, the belief in life beyond death and the belief in justice and eternity is quite frightening, because if you want to apply justice to other people, if you desire it for others, then you inevitably desire it for yourself.
Yeah.
And how will that be? There are many things which my conscience is afraid. The remembrance of them is grievous unto me. It's not necessarily self-serving to believe in this thing, because you turn it upon yourself. But on the other hand, I would feel that this is an incredibly empty existence if I didn't believe in this thing.
Yeah, well, I guess, Peter, we could probably talk all day about this
You
and go around
could.
in
I mean,
circles, yes.
I don't ever do anything other than to make this point. It's perfectly reasonable for an intelligent, educated person to believe in God, and I do get tired of people jeering as if you have to be some stupid turnip head to entertain such a belief, and also. There's so much assumption that a religious belief is literal-minded um, and and mechanical, and I don't think it's anything kind. I return to it as a mature person of reasonable experience, and I return to it with a much better grasp of it than I had before. On the other hand, I would say that if I hadn't been introduced particularly to its beauty and music at an early age, it might have been much harder to do that.
Okay. Just one final question on that. Do you read the Bible?
Well, I don't read it like a novel or indeed anything, or indeed a non-fiction work. I read bits of it. It's a library. It's to read it sequentially, page after page, would be like reading an electronics manual, a law book, a book of poetry, a book of prophecy. All in one goes. It's the same
Yeah.
thing, and it's ridiculous. There's sort of parts of it which I find more important than others. I'm particularly interested in the actual Gospels, the four Gospels in the New Testament, and the words of Christ Himself as recorded, which are astonishing. In some of the prophets, particularly Isaiah, who can make the heart sing, and the the Miles Coverdale version of the Psalms, which is to be found in the back of the Church of England's 1662 Book of Common Prayer. They're slightly different from the Psalms in the authorized version, but they are extraordinarily powerful. And they're plainly man speaking to God and often complaining, rather than God speaking to man. It's this idea, you sometimes get people, they read the lesson in church and they end it with this expression, this is the word of the Lord. Well, actually, no, it's not. An awful lot of the Bible isn't the word of the Lord. In the book of Job, for instance, there's never any such person as Job. The book of Job is obviously a parable. And the same with the Psalms. There's extraordinary curses that people calling down on their neighbors. The 109th is especially savage. M.R. James once wrote a very good ghost story about it. But it is... I don't claim to be hugely familiar with it. I'm not a biblical scholar, but there are parts of it which I read quite a lot. And if you attend church, as I try to do when the government isn't busily preventing me, you will find that you read or hear quite a lot of it in weekly worship. And so I don't claim to be hugely familiar. The people who are usually most familiar with the Bible are the clever atheists, like old Ingersoll, who knew it by heart and backwards. I'm not one of them. But no, yeah, it's a prop and stay, and much of it is very important to me. But I don't believe it as a literal account of the universe, and I don't believe I'm intended to.
Yeah, okay. Well, I actually used to read at Mass back in the day in my teenage years. So there you
But
go.
you had unfortunate translations of the Bible, which we don't have. The thing about the authorized version, which we used to use in the Church of England, has now almost entirely been suppressed. You can still get it. Is that it is so tremendously beautiful that it lingers in the mind.
Okay.
Once you've heard it, also it is. People say, "Oh, it's so old-fashioned." Actually, if you read it, large chunks of it are full of words of one or two syllables, incredibly easy to understand in the most beautiful plain English, which modern translations just can't do. And look at there's a passage in Isaiah comparing something to the shadow of a great rock in a weary land. Look up the new translations of that, or the scene where David is brought news of Absalom's death. Oh, Absalom, my son, would God that I had died for thee. And the new translations, they are so fantastically banal by comparison. They don't even begin. So we have this advantage in the Church of England, which nobody else has, of this extraordinary piece of literary and poetic beauty.
Okay.
Which has more power over the mind, I think, than the other versions.
Well, this kind of leads us on. I was going to ask this later on, but I might as well ask it now. here in Colombia, because I know you're a big believer in the traditional family unit, or at least I believe you are.
I'm a
And
believer
here
in a strong marriage, basically. Certainly, I'd rather have strong families than a strong state.
yeah, and like here, superficially, this is a very Catholic Christian country, but when you scratch below the surface, well, you've like a lot of single parent families. I think over 30% of children here are born into single parent families, and there's a little bit of a joke, but it's a reality here as well, that you have couples together that they've got his children, her children, and then our children together. So there's a lot of, well, I don't want to use the word not dysfunctional families, but not the traditional family unit. Would you see that as a kind of cause for concern, and maybe why certain countries find themselves with social problems?
Well, I think that from what we know, I know nothing of Colombia at all, so I don't even begin to comment on its problems. I have no facts, or let alone knowledge at my disposal. But in my own country, I think it's pretty statistically established, particularly for boys growing up, that the absence of a father is a fairly major disadvantage. So that's just a sociological fact. Mm-hmm. My own view is that there is very specifically Christian about lifelong solid marriage, because Christ himself speaks of it, and in one of his debates with the Pharisees, and says Moses allowed divorce because of the hardness of your hearts, but he himself takes the view that those who God hath joined together, let no man put asunder, which words are a part of the Anglican marriage service. And it is a huge, just like the refusal to kill unwanted children, which was a very big characteristic of the early Christians. It's a huge difference between Christianity and what preceded it. And it creates a different kind of society. You can have civilizations without Christianity, or even without religion. I mean, Japan is unquestionably an extraordinarily civilized society. And whether Shintoism is a religion or not, I don't know, but it's not what you would call a religious society, and certainly not a Christian one. So it's obvious you can have civilizations without it. What I say is there's a particular kind of civilization which arises out of Christianity, which is, amongst other things, much freer than a society where the family is a broken, scattered thing, and the state, by definition, is much more powerful, because the family is the big opposition to the state. It's a private world in which people have private life and private conversations, in which traditions and things are passed on, which the state doesn't necessarily want to be, and where all kinds of things are learnt by people who then grow up to become themselves strong, independent individuals. Without family, you don't have that. And mm-hmm. I think without an established husband and wife, it's difficult to have a strong family structure of that kind. So I prefer it. There's a wonderful, I think he actually comes from St. Augustine, but the second collect, no, the first collect of morning prayer, O God, who art the author of peace and lover of concord, in knowledge of whom standeth our eternal life, whose service is perfect freedom. Defend us, thy humble servants, in all sorts of our enemies, that we, surely trusting in thy defence, may not fear the power of any adversaries. It's extraordinary prayer to me, because of this declaration that the service of God is itself perfect freedom, that by following the laws of God, you actually make yourself free. And I think there is that is in itself a small metaphor for the whole idea. It's almost a Burkean idea that mm-hmm. a society in which men have agreed to abide of their own free will by certain accepted rules is a society which tends not to be under the domination of a strong state and be full of people pushing you around. If you can control yourself, if you can rule your own heart and life, then you don't need much in the way of government, just a sort of limited government, which particularly there is a difference here between Protestantism and Catholicism. The Anglosphere Protestant countries used very much to have, and now increasingly no longer do.
Yeah, of course. Now, just to put you in the picture on Colombia in that regard, I had James Robinson on the Brother podcast of this just over a year ago, the author of Why Nations Fail and The Narrow Corridor, or co-author, I should say. But he puts Colombia in the bracket of a weak society and a weak state. So it doesn't have any counterbalance at all. It's weak on both spheres.
Things can exist for limited periods of time in states of imbalance and uncompleted processes, but I think not indefinitely. Just as many of the Christian societies of the world continue to exist very much as if they were still Christian, because the muscle memory of Christianity is still in the people. People still remember how to behave. But in the end, if the beliefs which underpin those rules fade away, then I've always said you live in a period like the afterglow, after sunset, where there's still enough light in the sky to see by for a surprisingly long time. But in the end, that's what we're in. But in the end, when the darkness falls, it very, very much falls, and you can't. You're in a different world. We're in the whole of the formerly Christian world is now living in the afterglow of Christianity, but it doesn't last forever. And what follows it will be, to me, I find it quite alarming, but it'll also be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, Peter, it brings us kind of nicely along to the topic of the moment and lockdowns and, well, an interfering state now to the point of controlling every part of our lives. Now, of course, people will say it's because we're in this extraordinary, unprecedented time, to use the word of last year, with the pandemic. Now, this is one thing that both of us agree on. Both of us have been quite vociferous, you with a much bigger platform than me, but writing about what we feel as, well, that the lockdowns, the efficacy of them is questionable, to say the least, and the collateral damage that they can cause. Now, we get labeled as being COVID deniers, and which, of course, we're not. Well, certainly not. I know you're not as well. There might be some people who are COVID deniers, but neither of us are. So these lockdowns, just so people who mightn't be aware of your position on them, you feel that it's the wrong solution to the problem?
Well, I think that the simple thing to say is this. First of all, I've seen no evidence that this mass quarantining of the healthy, an unprecedented action by any government in the history of mankind, as far as I know, works. It's the scientific basis for it is extremely thin, in my view, and I don't actually think even its proponents would argue with that. All these, the 2-meter rule and the rest of it is pretty much made up as they went along. And the cases for things like face coverings and all the rest are also extremely weak. If you rely, as I try to do, on the scientific method, which says if someone has a proposition, then it's up to them to show that it's true, then objective experimental work to show that these things are actually effective is thin. And in terms of the effect of, if you look at all the countries that have experienced the virus and have taken action, if you look at if you make a kind of attempt to make a correlation between the level of stringency by which they've closed down their societies and the level of deaths which have followed, you can't even find a correlation. So it seems to me that the causation is going to be extremely elusive. So the people that are in favor of these things have made, it seems, a very poor case for them. Well, that wouldn't matter all that much if it was a minor adjustment in their lives they were asking for. The effects are colossal in terms of the assault on individual liberty and civil society, the closing down of so much of life, the confinement, particularly of the healthy old, away from activities which up till now kept them healthy. The considerable, though as yet not fully measured, collateral damage and lost medical treatment and all the other things which have probably caused quite a lot of unintended deaths. And above all, in material terms, you get accused by this of caring more about money than lives, but I have to point out that the economy is something in which we live and move and have our being. If the economy goes underwater, then all the things we rely on to stay healthy and alive, the health service, the clean water, the unpolluted air, the proper policing and criminal justice, everything suffers. And and unemployed people are much more likely to be unhealthy than employed people. So don't say that I'm just talking about greed and money versus life. It's life versus life. All these things. Ultimately, the thing is so disproportionate, this vast juggernaut of restriction and destruction and expenditure of money we don't have. The whole thing is so disproportionate that it seems to me to be like burning down your house to get rid of a wasp net.
Well, Peter, we're recording this on a
Getting
day.
out of proportion.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to say we're recording this on a day when the Office for National Statistics in the UK released their provisional figures on deaths for 2020, and we're told that there are about 90,000 excess deaths compared to the previous 5 years. So I guess people would say, when they read our stances in terms of saying, well, lockdowns were not the right answer, well, they go, well, look at it. If we didn't do anything, that number would be even higher. Now, I know my answer to that, but go on.
That's a claim completely without evidence to support it. Actually, I mean, the case of Sweden has been very interesting. I've never said, oh, Sweden got it right. Sweden was absolutely perfect, right? Because it wasn't. Anders Tegnell, the man in charge of the Swedish response, freely admits they completely messed up the care homes, and they had terrible numbers of deaths in care homes, at least as bad as those in Britain by proportion. So they didn't get that right. But what is interesting about Sweden is they did not resort to the shutdown of the economy. And there's another country I can't with at the moment which also didn't. And it hasn't actually, although people have died, in proportion to the population, it hasn't been significantly worse than those countries which did shut down. And the same fascinatingly true is of Japan, a country of which you may have already worked out I'm fascinated by. Mm-hmm. Their constitution forbids them to do the things which most of the Western countries did. They certainly couldn't do it, even if they wanted to, so they didn't. And the level of deaths in Japan is extremely low. And you have to work out why that would be if lockdowns were so effective and essential. It's idle to say it would have been worse if we hadn't done it, if you can't prove it. And I can't see how you can prove it.
Yeah.
The other thing, because as in the excess deaths in the past year, you also have to include those deaths, several thousand. The calculations vary, which I think can rightly be attributed to non-COVID deaths. And the other thing is, I have to refer you, because I am very, very limited in what I say here, because I cannot know. I just offer a critical thought. Refer you to the work of John Lee, a former professor of pathology at Hull, who has written extensively for the Spectator magazine. It's available easily on the web, mm-hmm. about the collection of statistics in this matter. And I do think that the attribution of death to COVID in my country has been, how shall I put it, open to some question. And there are deaths which have been attributed to COVID by media and political figures, which I think, right back in April, Dr. Jenny Harries, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer for England, said at one of the government's own press conferences that we had to distinguish between with COVID or off, and that some people had died with it who had not died of it. I think this is a very important distinction, and one that she was right to make, and I make it, as it were, with her considerable authority. And so are we actually being completely straight with ourselves about causation here? Yes, of course people have died of COVID, and particularly, as we know, in the care homes and others as well. But that doesn't mean that it justifies the extremely actually destructive actions which the government. I don't know people who've had their university educations destroyed by this, and people who've had their school educations destroyed. There are cases, there was a tragic one, one I fear of many on BBC Radio 4 on Monday, of a woman whose cancer treatment, her bowel cancer treatment, had been delayed, which is terrible because delay in treatment of discovered cancer can lead to horrible outcomes. And there's been a lot of this going on. As I say, hundreds, thousands of small businesses treasured, built up over years by people who mortgaged their houses to build them up, actually destroyed. Untold numbers of jobs, which will come to an end when this is over. And a debt, a peacetime debt greater than any ever contracted by any country. It's is this conceivably justified by these figures? Even if the claim that the dubious, in my view, claim that the lockdowns reduced the number of deaths significantly is true, would it be justified? Is it proportionate? Half of the trick of government is proportion. If my country was being invaded by people who wanted to drag us all away and enslave us in concentration camps, there is no measure which I would oppose to thrust them away from our shores. Not any. Mm-hmm. And if we were faced with a terrible pandemic of the kind which inflicted the world in 1918. Again, the levels of deaths, the huge numbers of young and healthy people struck down, the immensely greater mortality rates than what we have now. Yeah, that would justify all kinds of measures. Though whether it would justify quarantining the healthy, I very much beg to doubt. But huge amounts of resources should obviously be devoted to the medical services and to combating it, and I wouldn't be against it. But this doesn't seem to me to fit either of those pictures. Now, I could be completely wrong. Of course, I could be. I know I spent a large part of my life when I was a Marxist revolutionary being wrong. I've been wrong about a lot of other things as well. So any sane person has been wrong. But even if I am wrong, my opposition to this, if it had been properly heard, would undoubtedly have made the response more intelligent. Opposition in a free country is vital for efficient and effective government, because somebody has to say there are unintended consequences here. Hesitate over this. It makes for better government. But the reaction of the authorities to opposition to what they do is not to say, all right, well, it's legitimate in a country which has been free for centuries and pretty much pioneered the idea of an adversarial government and an official opposition. It's legitimate for you to criticize this. It's to say, shut up. And for supporters of that government to tell me I have blood on my hands or I'm stirring up hatred against the National Health Service or similar drivel of that kind, and to call me a COVID denier, which is not merely not true in that it would be ludicrous and stupid to deny the existence of a disease that obviously exists, but it's a dog whistle to try and equate me with the denier of the Holocaust, which no one in his right mind would dare to say to me directly. But they want to suggest it, willing to wound but afraid to strike, because they aren't any good at arguing, and they can't actually make a case against what I'm saying, so they smear.
Yeah, actually, I had an email exchange with the epidemiologist Hugh Montgomery, I think is his name. I think that's correct, over the Christmas, because he was on the BBC saying exactly that people who aren't following the coronavirus containment measures and things like that they do have blood on their hands. And I'd written an article last year kind of saying the opposite, that those who endorse lockdowns, widespread lockdowns, aren't looking at the other side of the ledger in terms of the consequences and the unintended.
Yeah, but you didn't say they had blood on their hands, did you?
I didn't, but I'm kind of saying if they're going to say,
you shouldn't say that. I mean, this is another effect of having been a Trotskyist. I completely refuse to act as if my opponents are my enemies. I absolutely, until it's proved beyond reasonable doubt that it isn't so, grant everybody the presumption of intelligence. Once they prove that beyond reasonable doubt they haven't got it, then things might differ a bit. But I completely work on the principle that my opponents have good intentions.
Well, fair enough. I will.
Civilization cannot survive unless you do that. You must assume they have good intentions. And again, unless it's proven beyond reasonable doubt that they have not, that they're mistaken rather than bad. And that and I expect the same in return.
Yeah.
I think that it's a civilization, one of the greatest discoveries of my late childhood, I suppose I found this out about 9 or 10 years old, because I had very good teachers, was that you could disagree with someone really very fiercely and still be on good terms with them. And I remember the moment I realized this, it actually gave me an actual feeling of joy. I thought, I never realized that before, and it's never left me. I absolutely love being able to disagree with someone while still liking them. And I think it's a basis of civil society that we are able to do this, and we should be glad to do it. And I defend it.
Well, you do actually enjoy getting into debates on social media as well.
Well,
it seems so. Yeah.
It's for me, to some extent, it's a substitute for the broadcasting I'm not really allowed to do in Britain anymore. The BBC has become more and more closed to my opinions, and this latest event has made it even more so. And here's an example. There's a program called Question Time, which is a sort of national debate program which goes out every Thursday night. I've been appearing on it roughly every year since 1996. So some years twice, some years just once. But I think I can say that I can't be no good at it to have been invited back that many times. But after March 2018, I haven't been asked once. Gone.
Okay.
And a lot of other things, the same sort of thing happened, because the BBC about 2 years ago finally got the confidence to be itself and to be overtly a broadcasting organization of the modern cultural revolution. And that makes me more or less unacceptable. I'm sure, without my knowledge, I get vetoed for an awful lot. But I still get on from time to time, but it's much diminished.
Yeah.
So, but the nearest I can get to broadcasting is Twitter, because it has the same immediacy, and it has an audience, and you can feel the effect of what you say coming back to you in a way that you also get it. I did once long ago have a show on the station which is still called Talk Radio. It was very different in those days, in which I insisted, the boss of it asked me to present a program. I said, well, that would be quite dull. It'd just be me going on at people. Why don't you hire a presenter who disagrees with me so we can argue over the issues of the week? And he said, good idea, and he did. And it's fantastic. It was great fun to do, and I still think very entertaining for the listeners. But it came to an end, but I've always missed it. And Twitter comes close to that in the exhilaration of battle. But that's really why I do it, because I can't broadcast as much as I like.
Well, yeah, live broadcast. I actually do a live show with a Bristol man here every Thursday, and I do like being. Well, I'm from a radio background, yeah. Mm-hmm. And when you get the interaction with people,
wonderful. It's I suppose like if I could ski really well, which I certainly can't, I think it would probably have some of the characteristics of that. I can ski very badly, so I have a sort of idea of what it would be like if I could do it well.
Well, I was just going to say, I do listen to the BBC quite regularly here, 5 Live, Radio 4, and different talk shows. Compared to Ireland's RTE, the BBC seems fairly balanced on this pandemic. RTE is just completely...
You think? I don't know. I can't. It's a comparison. I don't listen to RTE. So I don't know, but.
You never got a phone call from anyone at RTE Radio 1 then to bring you on?
Not lately, no. I've occasionally been on some of the commercial stations now, but again, not lately.
Okay.
But maybe that's the way it feels. It doesn't feel that way to me. I just, very occasionally, someone like Jonathan Sumption will get on. And so there are some programs where there are still vestiges of civilization where dissenting voices will get on. In general, the big flagship news programs are entirely of one mind, as far as I can see. Yeah. They set out each morning on the assumption that lockdown is good and works, for instance. And to question it is heretical. So you just don't get on.
Yeah, well, it does frustrate me when that comes up as well, I have to say. I'm kind of like almost tearing what's left of my hair out listening to that, because, yeah, it's all a one-way street. Just from a Colombian perspective as well, Peter, because I think I even think I could say I'm on stronger ground to argue against lockdowns in an emerging market country, because one could make the argument that the UK and Germany, Ireland, obviously have better resources to deal with this and lock down. Here, children haven't been at school for basically a year now, since March.
It's just so terrible. And of course, this falls so much more heavily on the children of the poor.
Exactly. Like, they've no access to proper... I mean, I'm lucky I have steady internet here, but you go into lower class neighborhoods here.
What are they going to do? How are they going to do online teaching?
Exactly. So what kind of damage are we doing to them long term? Now, there'll be a counter argument that, well, the education they get in public schools here is shocking anyway, so they're not missing out on much, which could be a fair point. But
I suppose so, but it's It's very strange, is all I can say. It's very strange that it should be tolerated so readily. Something so one of the great advances of the major civilizations in the 19th century was the institution of mass public education, and it was transported. I agree that the schools have not in recent years necessarily been improving, but they're certainly better than no schools at all.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah.
And simply to close down. Also, we all know this, that schools perform very important social services functions, particularly for the children of the poor. And in poor countries, that's magnified. So again, to close them down is to close a portal to help that would otherwise be open. It's just all part of what I think one day may be called the great mistake.
Yeah, I guess future historians will give us their say.
They are, and I'd think if somebody at some point with authority of thought doesn't say this was completely crazy, I shouldn't be surprised. It just has that aspect to me, and I lived in a crazy country for a while. I lived in the last days of the Soviet Union. It was a mad country, and there were many instances of its lunacy. But lately, in my own country, I've been thinking, well, it seems to be pretty much like that.
Yeah,
in a different way. But dogma has obviously taken over from reason in so many cases.
Well, I had Neil Ferguson on the podcast last year, and as he put it, future historians might judge COVID-19 not as a viral infection, but as a mental illness.
Well, yeah. The problem is that it may well be that the future historians of our time will be Chinese.
Right, yeah, and well, we are going through our 1984 Orwellian moment here, so who knows? Yeah, everything will be rewritten. Just finally on this, because people will say, okay, you're saying lockdowns don't work. Then would it be the solution that you give more independence to the individual? You say, look, this is what we know about the virus, and it's how lethal it is, etc., and who are most vulnerable, and these are the rules, or not the rules. This is what we suggest.
I'm not an expert on medical treatment of any kind. I'm not. I don't pretend to be. I do know that previous large-scale outbreaks of disease have not been treated in this way. Particularly one thinks of the Asian flu of 1957 and the Hong Kong flu of 1968-69, which are of comparable magnitude. There was more. I think we were actually better at that time in quarantining the sick. And I think one way in which modern hospitals often fail is they simply aren't easy to segregate. They're huge, and if you have a group of COVID patients in a large hospital, it's very hard to keep the hospital-acquired infection from spreading. We might have been better at finding a way of avoiding that. I think the immediate devotion of the maximum number of resources that you could possibly do to the doctors and nurses would have been something that everybody would have supported. It's clear we should have handled the care homes better, though I can't say myself that I would have known that, but perhaps somebody else ought to have done. There are many things we could have done, but what I would say in general is that leaving the management of epidemics to medical professionals and to experienced hospital managers would seem to me to make sense. You don't, just because the chosen route of the government is this huge, thundering 500 megaton juggernaut of utopian power, it doesn't mean that the alternative has to be of the same kind. The alternative might be actually much smaller and more modest and yet more successful. And what I'm fundamentally against is, I find increasingly, is this utopianism, this belief that disease can be defeated totally, that the virus can be suppressed. I think that's unrealistic in the history of the world. And it's just an overestimate of human power over things we can't do. What you can do is you can alleviate, ameliorate, palliate in hundreds of different ways. The other things that you obviously needed to do very quickly was to discover how to treat it. And the discovery, for instance, in some hospitals that it appeared to be a coagulant, and that people suffering from severe COVID had coagulated blood, which has enormous effects on the body, which have to be very rapidly put right. The discovery that ventilators in many cases were not particularly effective, and that other ways of getting more oxygen into the blood took a while. But these things, it seems to me, could all have been achieved without shutting down the country. And when I referred earlier to you're living in a street of terraced houses, and your neighbour's got a wasp nest. You propose to burn his house down. You say, well, actually, Fred, don't do that. And he said, well, his reply as he applies the match and the petrol to the house is, well, what would you do instead? And I'm afraid my reply is not that.
Yeah.
We'll discuss what else I would do once you stop trying to burn your house down, because when you burn yours down, you'll burn mine down too, which is, of course, what's happened. Nobody will be immune from the effects of this in so many ways. A lot of people, I mean, whose job is now safe? How many people will face serious delays in important surgery, from everything from eye surgery to cancer surgery to treatment for strokes? How many people will face that and will never afterwards recover what was lost? How many immense delays to so-called elective operations, which people badly need to live a normal life? How many old but healthy people given up, demoralized after months of enforced solitude and the breakup of all their networks and the stopping of all their activities? It's colossal. And as we discussed, how many children with education with a vast gaping gap in it, which is irrecoverably lost? You can't time is one thing you do learn. I've once lost. Who knows whether time ever comes back? And it's lost. These children have lost a year of education or a year of university. In many cases, the most important one they had, and it won't come back. They have burned the house down, and they've burned other people's houses down. And for what? I still say, for what? Has it actually done any good? If they were more inclined to listen, then I would be more sure that they thought they knew what they were doing. But I suspect their dislike of listening has a lot to do with the fact they're not very confident themselves.
Yeah, well, we talk about herd immunity. This is kind of the herd mentality of this is the path we're taking, and that's it. Yeah, but we'll leave the pandemic at that for the moment, and hope. Well, who knows that if the vaccine rollout is successful and all that kind of stuff.
Well, I do. For heaven, it would be so wonderful if it were, and if it was. But the funny thing is that even though the vaccine is being distributed in large numbers, and many people already had, there's no sign in the attitude of the British government of any let up at all. On the contrary, they're already talking about introducing yet more restrictions. I don't. We're constantly offered our liberation and release from all this, but it never comes.
Yeah, there's always another excuse or another reason.
There's always something else. Then some new variant or other will come along, and the vaccine one. I don't know what it will be. But until I actually have my freedom back in my hand, I'm not going to believe I will see it again.
Well, you might be waiting a long time for that, Peter, but I want to move on.
Yeah, but I thought all this stuff would happen after I was dead. I'm slightly perplexed to find that the final strangulation of my country as I knew it is taking place while I'm still alive. Still, that may not last forever.
We'll have you back in a few months and we'll see where we are, Peter. But I want to talk about something that's very close to this country, and it's a topic obviously that you've written about that I mentioned at the top of the interview, the war on drugs, or the war in inverted commas. And of course, here in Colombia, the unofficial home of cocaine, I think Peru has taken over in terms of production, but obviously it's synonymous with cocaine. But you feel, from a British perspective anyway, that they never fought a war, and you're very
different. This is two wholly different experiences, which can't even begin to be compared or equated. Indeed, in the what I might call the consumer countries, the whole idea that the use of drugs might be discouraged by penalizing users and buyers was abandoned really at the end of the 1960s. And I think that abandonment is one of the main reasons why drug use has risen so very much in Britain. And there are two reasons why I can say this with confidence. One is that I can remember before that time that people were considerably restrained from buying and using drugs by the fear that they might be caught and severely punished. And secondly, there are two major countries in the world, and here we come again, it's Japan and South Korea, which continue to apply severe criminal sanctions to the possession, particularly of marijuana. And I think it would be hard to say it wasn't as a result of it, given what's happening in the rest of the advanced world. They simply don't have the problem at the level that other advanced countries do. And therefore, it is perfectly possible for a free law-governed country to apply law against it. And the other thing is this, of course, the Colombian business with the cartels and everything else makes everyone think of Mr. Big and the terrible drug gangs which do such terrible things to the countries in which they operate, and who can doubt it? But I would say, instead of looking for Mr. Big, remember, where does Mr. Big get his money from to pay his killers and to buy his guns and to maintain his operation? He gets all that money. It comes out of the pockets of selfish young people in Europe and North America who buy the drugs and send the money off down to them. Without their money, this stuff would have the market value of beetroot. Mm-hmm. And it's the origin of the drug problem of the whole world is the purchase of drugs and the use of drugs by rich people in first world countries. And if you wanted to get rid of the problem, that's where, in my view, you'd start. But there's revulsion from that for reasons which I go into in my book.
Yeah, there is a debate here now. It's been ongoing for the last few years about legalizing, or at least kind of liberating the market here a little bit in terms of personal possession. But you wouldn't be for that at all, because there are two.
Well, there's why that doesn't work. The first is that there really is a growing amount of evidence. It's correlation at the moment, but I think that causation will eventually be established. Correlation is extremely strong. Professor Sir Robin Murray, the distinguished psychiatrist at the Maudsley Hospital in South London, who deals with a lot of this, says that the correlation is so strong that it really is very difficult to argue against a causal element. There is a definitely link between the use of marijuana and mental illness. And when I say mental illness, I don't just mean people going doolally after they've smoked a spliff. I mean people going permanently, irreversibly mentally ill, often in rather terrible ways, ruining their own lives and those of their families. And I get a lot of correspondence about this, particularly from families who've been the victims of it. So to encourage, or in any way cease to discourage, the use of a drug which can have that sort of effect, particularly on the young. And many people start smoking marijuana in school if they can go there. Ages 11, 12, 13 in my country, when the brain is at its most vulnerable. So this is a big problem which you would want to guard against. The other is that it's a simple, think about this, simple proposition I'll make to you: all crime is caused by law. If we decided that we didn't disapprove of anything, everybody could do anything they liked, from murder to burglary to rape, then we would need none of these tedious police forces and prisons and courts. We could just we make things illegal because they're bad. And I think that marijuana and the other drugs were made illegal because they are bad and because they do a great deal of damage both to their users and society. And it's also not true that if you legalize something, it expels criminals from it, because law is not the only thing which affects commodities of this kind. The moment the moment a drug which is popular goes on the market, is advertised, is available in supermarkets and all the rest of it, it's taxed. Mm-hmm. And it's either taxed in form of duty, or it's taxed in the form of straightforward sales tax. Whatever it is, there is a tax on it, and therefore there is immediately an incentive for people to start smuggling it and for people to start selling it illegally. And in those parts, particularly of North America, I think Canada and Colorado, where it's now on legal sale, the two powerful forces have led to the very considerable survival of criminal gangs marketing it. One is that the attempts to limit the strength have made a great opportunity for those illegal sellers who can sell higher strength. And the other is, again, the price of untaxed marijuana is significantly lower than that of tax. So it simply isn't true that by decriminalizing you solve these problems. All the arguments for decriminalization are observably empty, and you still have this problem, as I say, of the mental illness, which is I also would point out, marijuana use can be found in the perpetrators of appallingly large numbers of violent crimes, and indeed of massacres, including the horrible murder of Lee Rigby in London, the Bataclan and Charlie Hebdo murders in Paris, and in fact almost all the French and Belgian outrages, of which we know so much, were perpetrated by people who had long-term marijuana use in their histories. So we're dealing with something which is a very, very big problem, and to go lax on it now would be a grave mistake. Now, I'm prepared to wait 20 years until the work's done. If we can show that these correlations are in fact meaningless, then okay, I'll back off.
Okay.
But just at the exact moment when the problem seems to be emerging and when the correlation seems to be very strong would not be the moment to legalize, because legalization is irreversible. You could not now, however hard you tried, you could not now make alcohol illegal. It's been legal for so long. The Islamic Republic of Iran has tried to do so, and I can tell you from having been there, total failure. And as for cigarettes, the efforts made against huge commercial lobbying, amongst other things, the efforts made to stamp out cigarette smoking in the major Western countries so far not by any means entirely succeeded, I think I could say without
yeah. Just briefly to bring it back to Colombia here, because one of the controversial measures to eradicate cocaine production here has been the United States-backed spraying of the coca leaf. And of course, that's linked to indigenous tribes who have been using that leaf for millennia. And it reputedly has some very good health benefits. I had a journalist on last month talking about those of the coca leaf itself and the different products. Then you can get coca flour and things like that. So, I mean, that strategy here of spraying the crop to eradicate it, it kind of seems a little bit over the top, I would think.
Well, I doubt whether it'd be effective. I mean, if somebody is selling something which people like, and you close his shop, then within a week, another shop selling the same thing will have sprung up within half a mile. What you suppressing or trying to interdict supply, if you do nothing about demand, is one of the most futile actions known to man. There's no point in it. Leaving aside whether it's effective, whether it isn't open to corruption and all kinds of other things, leaving aside the question of whether the substance involved in some circumstances might have health benefits or not, which I'm not qualified to argue about. The whole idea that you can, by trying to stop the supply, stop it being grown, stop it being transported, to stop it being smuggled into the countries, is absurd. As long as the demand is there, the price will cover the necessary measures to get round and overcome these interdictions, and it has. It is just a complete flop, and it always will be a flop. The only way you will do anything about it at all is to suppress demand, and as I said, Japan and South Korea have both shown how that can be done, and that it can be done if anybody wants to. But nobody does, because basically the boomer generation is suffused with drugs. They all took drugs at the university. They allow their children to take drugs. Many of them still take drugs as adults. The smoking of the joint was the sort of Holy Communion rite of the new civilization. And they believe, bizarrely, that it's a sort of torch of liberation. I would say this is an absurdity because, of course, if you really wanted to be a dictator, the sort of population you'd like most would be a stupefied population, wouldn't it?
Well, that's
certainly
for sure.
not one of the great freedoms. The freedom to dope yourself into a stupor is not one of the freedoms like speech, thought, and assembly that needs to be stood up for. And yet you will get this argued by marijuana defenders.
Well, okay.
Believe me.
Yeah. Well, Peter, I think we've gone on for an hour here, so it might be an appropriate time to wrap up here. But just one fight. Have you been to this part of the world by any chance?
No, the nearest I've been is Venezuela.
So you have been to Venezuela, because I was going to ask about
very brief visit to Caracas a few years ago, which was alarming but interesting.
Do you, in a word, and I know it's difficult to give a sentence answer to this, but would you back more direct U.S. action in Venezuela to topple Maduro?
No, I'm against toppling other people's governments. I think people should sort out their own destiny. I think probably if Venezuela had been left to its own devices more in the past, it might have. It's a tragedy of South America. There's been so much external pressure, normally from the north, on people to change their governments, which has seldom worked out well. If a country is sovereign, I'm pretty much against anyone messing around with it. I'm certainly no defender of Chavez, but I think if a new, and I think that it's been tragic for many people, and I would hate to be stuck there under such a catastrophic government, but that does not license external forces to come in and say we're going to change the government for you. People have to do it themselves, I think.
Yeah,
I'll stick to that.
Of course, many Venezuelans are voting with their feet right now.
Well, of course they are, and who can blame them? And I hope that when they get out, people are kind to them. But that doesn't solve it either, does it?
No, it doesn't. And,
but it's been such a long history of intervention and messing around in Latin America. And one of the most extraordinary ironies is, for instance, is that the initial rise of Castro was more or less promoted by the United States. I mean, they were the ones who forced Batista out, and look how that worked out.
Yeah, it's true. Like any U.S. intervention.
That's another place. That's the only other Latin American state that I've visited, which doesn't really. It's so completely different from all the others. It's hard to say. Yeah. But mainland South America, I'm very, very embarrassingly unfamiliar with.
Well, you might be glad to know, Peter, that Colombia, in terms of presidents, has kind of stuck to a very center-right lineage over the years. It's never gone left at all, actually. It's unique among Latin American countries in that regard. And nowadays, with what's happening in Venezuela, I don't think we'll ever see a leftist president.
It's a living lesson right next door of what to avoid, isn't it? But Colombia doesn't have oil, does it?
Oh, it does, yeah, but it's. I think it's reached its peak as far as I know. But yes, it does have oil.
Nothing like the Venezuelan.
Oh no, not nothing like that. Yeah, but look, Peter, thanks a million for your time. As I said, we've gone on an hour here, and there's a lot more we could talk about. But maybe in a few months' time we'll have you.
Maybe another time.
Back.
Thank you anyway for having me.
Yeah, and people can find you. By the way, I must comment. I love your Twitter. You follow nobody. You have about 150-something thousand followers.
Yeah, it's dropping at the moment. They keep taking them away.
Oh, really? but you don't follow anybody.
By an invisible hand. No, well, if you want an explanation of that, there genuinely is a blog posting called Peter Hitchens FAQs. It will explain everything.
Okay.
From drugs to Twitter. Everything you want to know about me and many things you don't are all there. Peter Hitchens FAQs, I recommend.
Wonderful. We'll check that out. Well, I'm going to do my own little plug here. You can find me on Twitter at WWayCorrigan. On Facebook, the blog page is Wrong Way Corrigan, the blog. But until the next time, guys, it's ciao from Bogota.